All right. I pushed that button and we are live on broadcast here from the Hill Country in Texas. And through the magic and wonder of modern technology, we have Mark Devlin from the Midlands in England joining us today. And Mark, it's great to have you on. I've been tangentially kind of following your comet trail a little bit through Emily and Randy and some other folks. And just so happens that you came up on Steve's radar and you're ready to do some interviews and do some other work. And it's like, great, let's have you on. Had wanted you on last year. You're working on a novel. So timing is everything. Welcome to the show. Appreciate you being here.
Well, thanks, brother. Thanks for the invitation. Good to be on with you. I think we've got a mutual friend in Darren Williams out of Liverpool.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
He's always bigging you up. He's always showing respect to your show, and he's always telling me I should listen to your stuff. And I think he digs my stuff as well. So he's a mutual contact of ours.
Darren is like this digital gadfly. I mean, he's kind of everywhere, and he moves between all these very interesting worlds. From like underground hip hop and electronic music to Stanley Kubrick and politics, and I love Darren, and he's been on my show a couple of times. So there we go. Cool. There's the connecting thread. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So you guys did not you weren't here for the beginning of the show. I asked Mark how he was, and he said, "I'm here," and I think that's a pretty good place to start our conversation. We're here now. We're in the midst of a very interesting time, and we're going to get into the time that we're in a little bit later. We're going to try to do the show kind of in halves, although I think ultimately it's all connected. But the first part of our discussion today, I really wanted to start to chat with you about music and really the sort of where the state. By the way, Mark has written 2 books about music. And you can find them over on his website, markdevlin.co.uk.
And the third is up here. The third is in the brain. Just needs to go onto the page.
So this is a really interesting place for us to start because you and I, although we're probably a little bit different in age, grew up in a period where music was really important. Like it was one of the pillars of our existence in a lot of ways. And that has just been completely removed from our social landscape. It's there, but it resembles nothing in a lot of ways, like kind of what we grew up with. And I wanted to get your take on that because I think music is a really important thing. And now it's been shoved aside into this kind of very weird and strange sort of app that's available in our life.
Yeah, it really has. It was very important in my life. Anyone of my generation would have placed a lot of reverence onto the whole concept of popular music. Doesn't really matter what style or genre you were into, everyone was into something. And when I was growing up, it was, very important what records were in the charts. It was very important what was number 1 that week. I remember at school in the mid-80s, there used to be a couple of kids that would come in with a radio cassette player on a Tuesday afternoon when they announced the new chart. And everyone was just so desperate to find out the top 5 and which record was at number 1. It was very, very important to get that information early on. Charts mattered back then. Right. I don't think charts have mattered for about 20 years now. I haven't been able to tell you what's been number 1 in the charts for the last 25 years because I've not cared, because it just doesn't matter anymore. But back then it did. And this was in the era of vinyl records. You can't see it at the moment, but in my music room here, I'm surrounded by vinyl records. I mean, I've got one here by way of an example. Incognito, don't you worry about a thing. There's a message for these times, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, I used to buy vinyl, and that used to be a very important ritual for other kids of my age, going to a record shop, standing up there at the counter, playing the vinyl, working out which ones you liked, which ones you wanted to buy, handing over your hard-earned cash to get those records. And then when I became a DJ, it became part of the job to go and hang out in record shops and get all the latest imports and all the latest promos. Very, very important. Now, here we are in 2020, and music just really doesn't matter anymore, as you said. And kids now are listening to it by way of MP3 icons on a phone screen or on a laptop, or little snippets of tunes on TikTok or something like that, through these stupid little tinny speakers that really don't do any music any kind of justice. And it's just a testament to how little music matters now. And that's been systematic. That's been manipulated into the culture. I just completed a video which I'm putting out this weekend where I was talking about all the latest government responses to the coronavirus pandemic, and I was talking about all these different institutions that are being allowed to open up in a phased kind of way. So shops and supermarkets always stayed open. Then you had things like barber shops and nail salons were allowed to open, DIY stores and some of these larger department stores. Then you had pubs and restaurants, and then you had gyms and swimming pools. And the very last types of institutions to open up are nightclubs and live music venues. And that says a lot, because there's very little importance placed on these types of institutions anymore. And whenever budgets get slashed at schools or universities, or whenever government grants have to be cut in the interest of austerity, it always seems to be the arts, it always seems to be entertainment, it always seems to be aspects of popular culture, and particularly those related to music, that are the first casualties, as if they're just not deemed important. It's not something anyone needs in their lives. It's not essential like other aspects of our lives. But, I'm sure the likes of us would argue that music is an essential component to our lives. As I said, everyone likes some kind of music. It speaks to them in some meaningful kind of way. And removing people's access to that is depriving them of a very vibrant and very uplifting part of their life, I feel. We're meant to be listening to music. Its sound vibration is part of the very foundation of this physical reality in which we find ourselves. And music is a gift, it can be viewed as a gift. The word music is derived from the muses, and that's a concept of these kind of angelic spiritual beings that existed in other dimensions, and which gave these gifts to humanity through expressing themselves through music. It's a concept that came out of ancient Greece, I think. So to me, music is very spiritual. To many other people it is as well, and we do need it in our lives, and it just doesn't seem to matter in many people's lives now in the way that it used to.
Yeah, no, it's a very, very different break in reality and how we process this very interesting art form that speaks to our emotions, speaks to our intellect, speaks to our bodies when we move with it. It really touches a lot of different areas of our personal experience, and it's been removed. And the part that you brought up about nightclubs and theaters and such, this is a really important piece to wrap your head around, because here, of course, in the States, it's sort of like Friday night at the riots now. And this is what we've got going on in places like Chicago and Portland and Seattle, New York. In many instances of cases, a lot of those people would actually be at a nightclub, right? They would actually be hanging out. They'd be partying. They'd be working things out in a different kind of way. And now that those venues are shut down, what are they going to do? It's kind of like, when Boys Club shuts down, they go back on the streets, and I think a lot of what we're seeing here is a result of this sort of this shutting down of this social function, and it has to go somewhere, and it's being directed now in a very specific and very violent, very anarchic, and very, very disruptive way.
I made the point in the video that I just recorded that there's very little value placed on DJs in all of this as well. So for 20 odd years, I was a DJ, club and radio DJ, and that was my main source of income. The only way I could eat and the only way I could keep a roof over my head was going out and doing gigs every single weekend, getting paid for it. And I still have many friends who are DJs, and for them, it's their sole source of income, or it was before all these lockdowns. I mean, a few years ago, I diversified and started to take on different jobs. I didn't want to put all my eggs in one basket, so that if, something happened to my DJ career, I wouldn't be able to support myself. But I do have many friends and many DJ associates around the world who, as a result of the past few months, with all the clubs being shut down, have had nowhere to go out and perform, which means they've had no way to earn an income. And there seems to be very little value placed on them. Governments are talking about supporting various industries, supporting various types of workers. DJs just don't figure in that at all. The idea is that they just don't matter. They're just insignificant. There is an art form to DJing. That's the truth of it. I mean, most of the music that's around at the moment, in my opinion, and I've been very outspoken about it, is straight garbage. I don't care for it. I believe it's doing great damage in many cases. But that doesn't take away from the fact that there is an art form to DJing. It's not just some random dude up there slapping on a few records. That is not what DJing is all about. It is, you are an artist when you're a DJ in its true form, because you're sequencing the music in a meaningful way. You're building a vibe, you're building an atmosphere, you're sweeping people through the various stages of the night if you're doing it professionally. And most DJs are professionals, and they've not been able to work and exercise that aspect of themselves these past few months. I'm sure many of them are deeply depressed. Many of them would have got into debt, and nobody seems to care about them or think about them. You know, it's a legitimate job. The same thing goes for live musicians. Many live musicians will have been in the same position these past few months. And, you know, these are creative individuals with a great deal of skill and talent that have been deprived of being able to apply themselves in this way. And that's pretty tragic.
Yeah. You know, one of the core people in Black Lives Matter is a woman by the name of Alicia Garza. And one of the things that she's come right out and said is that, we're not for the gig economy. Like, we're not about the gig economy. We're not about the individual, because the gig economy is anti-union. You know, they're all about unionization. You know, it's the old kind of Soviet bloc model. So DJs fall into that territory. They fall into that category, you know, because they're playing gigs. So when we look at this kind of evolution, if we want to call it that, it's more of a de-evolution into this reset. These kinds of creative roles are not going to be deemed necessary, because it's all going to be based on systems management, right? Systems management, systems control. So if it fits into a system and it fits into a widget, it will be allowed to exist, and those widgets will be defined by a certain group of people. And the sort of the macro version of the widget will be like either the union or the group set or whatever. And if it doesn't fit, it won't fit, and it just won't be applicable. So the DJ really, in my estimation, is like the apotheosis of the individual, right? And then now what we're seeing across all these different platforms is this top-down sort of suppression of the individual. And I think the DJ really stands for that in a lot of ways.
I joked a few years ago in the very first book that I put out. So before Musical Truth, I put out a book in 2007 when I was still fast asleep. I was one of the slumbering zombies in society, you know. But I did put out a book consisting of tales and anecdotes from the sharp end of the DJing game. It was called Tales from the Flip Side. And in that, I joked, this was writing in 2006, that in years to come, human DJs would be replaced by artificial intelligent bots that would do the job for them. And I intended that as a joke when I made the comment, but here we are all these years later, and I can see that actually starting to become a reality. I mean, first of all, whereas DJs used to play off vinyl, and when you were mixing tunes, it relied entirely on human skill to match those beats together, just using your ears and using your sharp, consciousness. But now you've got laptop systems. You've got DJing software like Serato and Traktor, which if you want to be lazy and non-creative about it, you can set these things to an auto sync function where it will actually match the beats for you. And you can just stand back and it mixes your tunes in for you. So there's phase one of the AI stuff coming in. But I made the joke that you're going to get artificial intelligent robot DJ systems that will determine how busy a dance floor is in a club at any given time by taking the temperature of it, or by using sensors to work out how many people are on the dance floor at any given time. And then it's going to send an instruction to this vast digital archive of tunes as to what sort of record you want to play. So if it detects that there's a hen party and there's a group of women, a group of drunken women on the dance floor, it's going to say, oh, you need to play Dancing Queen by ABBA or something like that. And it's going to automatically select that tune and put it on. And I no longer consider that to be a joke, because I'm starting to see this as a reality. I'm sure we're not far off from that type of situation arising.
Yeah. It all kind of boils down to this version of systems management. And, you know, the abstraction of that systems management, taking all the data in that space, processing it, and then spitting out the the algorithm for, that moment or the next moment or whatever. It's a terrifying thought, but we're not very far away from that idea, which is absolutely chilling in a lot of ways.
Yeah, yeah. It is such a shame that DJs are looked down on and frowned upon in so many ways in society. There's not a lot of value placed on that as a career path.
It's all about time and place, right? Because in California in the late '90s, that was like one of the hottest things to be. And if you were a DJ in California in the late '90s, up to the early 2000s, and you were good, I mean, you had a golden ticket, right? I mean, but then things shifted and changed. I used to go to Winter Music Conference in Miami, and they bring in all the Danny Tenaglia and all these guys, and I mean, for a while there, it was like being a god, really. And now there's a whole different reality, obviously. So we've seen the sort of the peak of that period where this individual kind of personification was massive. I mean, if you were in that world, you had people like Paul Oakenfold and all these big names. I mean, they were the it people then, and now, it's a memory in a lot of ways.
It feels like a bygone era, doesn't it? I've got to say, I was actually very surprised when they shut everything down to the extent that they did back in March in the case of the UK. There were whisperings in the weeks leading up to, it was week commencing 16th of March. I remember it well because I was due to be in Australia that week. I had a speaking tour lined up in Australia, and I was all set to fly out on Monday, the 16th of March. And I had to take the difficult decision on that day to abandon the trip, because there was all this rhetoric starting to creep in about airlines are going to shut down and people are going to be quarantined and you might get stranded in another part of the world and not be able to get back. So I had to take the decision not to go in the end. And towards the end of that week, Boris Johnson, UK Prime Minister, announced that all these businesses were going to have to shut down and everything was effectively on lockdown, with the exception only of supermarkets and food shops, and everyone was going to have to stay in their homes. But at the time, I remember thinking they're not going to keep this up for too long, because they have so much invested in popular culture and entertainment and the music industry as a tool for mind control, social engineering, and social manipulation. I've covered this in my 2 books. I thought they've put so much into degrading and debasing popular music, particularly what's referred to as urban music, so-called R&B, so-called hip-hop and rap, which is nothing of the sort anymore, but that's still the label that it carries. So-called electronic dance music. In my opinion, in my view, the vast majority of this stuff is straight garbage, and has been for many years, and has been steered off in a certain direction in order to have a detrimental impact on the young people that listen to it. And I've got some similar views about how large club events have been used for the same purposes, and large dance music festivals, in terms of all the symbolism, all the occult stuff that gets put out there, what's going on with the sound frequencies, what's going on with the drugs that people are consuming, and what effect the combination of those influences could be having on large numbers of people. I thought to myself, they've invested so much in these industries and they've taken it so far along that they're not going to want to miss out on that opportunity for mind manipulation for too long. But it seems I was wrong, because here we are over 4 months later in the UK, with no sign of nightclubs starting back up, with no indication of any dance music festivals happening this year. And it appears they really are stretching this whole thing out, and they're just looking at those missed opportunities for mind control and mental manipulation through dance music events as collateral damage that they must bear as a result of these lockdown measures. I'm very surprised at how long this whole thing has been dragged out. But all the way back in March and April, we were getting news of dance festivals that were going to be cancelled, going way into the summer and into the autumn. There were events that were scheduled for September and October that were getting cancelled back in March.
Right.
And I'm thinking, how can you possibly know where we're going to be at that many months down the line? How can the organizers of these festivals know that things aren't going to be back to normal by then? Well, the only way they would know is if they had some kind of tip-off, some kind of inside knowledge of what this whole agenda was going to consist of. So pretty much everything has been cancelled in 2020. You might as
Mhm.
well just throw out all your calendars, throw out all your diaries. You won't be needing one this year. And everything seems to have been shifted to 2021. So all these big festivals that were scheduled for this summer are now said to be happening in 2021. So we've kind of got to hope that there is a bit of inside knowledge there, and that these people do know, have it on good authority, that by summer 2021, there is going to be some semblance of normality back, and that this whole coronavirus scam is something that's pretty much going to be limited to this nightmare write-off year of 2020.
Yeah, I wouldn't count on it. Because my experience is that we're not going back. Like, it is whatever happened pre 3/11, we're just not going back. And the type of propaganda, social engineering, mind control that you were talking about, in a nightclub setting, in a festival setting, drugs, tones, frequencies, et cetera, right? That was a certain type of programming. Well, they're moving on to a different type of programming, right? They don't need that anymore. So we're being completely socially re-engineered now. And
well, that's a possibility. They consider that a closed phase now. It's done what it was intended to do. Now Absolutely. It's on to the next step. That seems to be what's happening here.
Right. So now what we're dealing with is we're dealing with moving the goalposts. Right. Moving the goalposts is always part of the program now, which is, well, you have some maybe inside knowledge, or people are saying, hey, 2021 looks like we're going to kick this thing back up again. I would bet, like, whatever silver I have right now, that when we get to 2021, they're going to move the goalposts again, because this has been the program. This is what they do. So we're being conditioned in a very, very different kind of way. Dashed expectations, leaning on the so-called scraps and tidbits from our masters, that when they give us a little bit of something, we should be really grateful for it. Like, I saw your video where you went into a pub, where the pub was kind of a normal pub, right? You didn't have to kind of do the lineup and all that. And it was like, in that moment, you're thinking, holy Christ, I just stepped into Valhalla here, and really what you were just doing is stepping into something that, used to be, or, was the old normal. But in that moment, it was really, really something. And I feel like this is part of this experiment that's going on. And I know that you played some stuff from Polly and her video on the Chinese torture stuff, and it really fits this model that we're in. So
psychological torture.
It is total psychological torture. So the social engineering is continuing, sans music, sans beats, sans sensorium. It is the anti-sensorium now. We're being taken into some level of desolation. That's what it feels like.
Yeah, I never saw that coming. I mean, I never saw the whole coronavirus thing coming. I don't think anyone did. If you're not on the inside and you had advanced knowledge of it, I'm sure it's hit everyone like a bolt out of the blue. Who would have believed on New Year's Day 2020 that 7 months later we'd be living in these bizarre ritualistic ways? Never saw that coming. And I never saw it coming that they would completely cut off all the subliminal influences of the dance music industry and everything that's been used to bring in, and just move on to something else. And it makes me wonder what the big name DJs are making of this, because I've been following some of these, and they're all doing live streams from home. So you got Carl Cox, he's out there in Australia. You got Pete Tong, he's based in LA. You got Judge Jules in London. I've just been keeping an eye on all these guys. Paul Van Dyke in Berlin. And they're all doing weekly live streams from their home. They're behind their decks. They're dancing around. They're acting like they're in a club, Right. And I'm looking at these guys and I'm thinking, you didn't know about this, did you? You didn't know this was coming. You weren't given this kind of insight. I really get that impression with them, because these guys, up until the early part of this year, were flying around the world, playing all these festivals, playing all these big clubs and doing world tours and making huge, colossal amounts of money out of it. And now they can't. Now they're stuck at home like the rest of us, having to play tunes on their own in their living room. And it's just not the same. And a few of them have made comments like, we'll be doing this for as long as lockdown is on, and then we'll get back to normal. Or, it's just, we're doing this temporarily till we can all get back in the clubs. They seem to be of the view that everything is going to go back to the way it was. And I've named many of these guys in my books as assets of the industry. I think the likes of Carl Cox and Pete Tong and many others have been used to push certain agendas. They are the chosen ones at the very top of their game. And they've been pushing certain things that have been beneficial to the social engineers. But I don't think they were privy to what's going on now. And it makes me wonder where their careers are going to go from here.
You know, there's the movie Eyes Wide Shut, and they have the party, right? At the mansion, and the piano player Nick Nightingale is there, and I would assume that there would be a small group of DJs who would be sort of the equivalent of Nick Nightingale playing at these very, very underground, very select, very elite kinds of events. And I think those guys are probably working, and they're probably doing incredibly well. I mean, this is just my instincts. Maybe you might know something along these lines.
I don't know of that, but as you were saying it, Paul Oakenfold sprang to mind as the most likely candidate for that sort of thing, because he really seems to be a chosen one. He's a real favorite of, the social engineers. I also considered that when the UK was getting put on lockdown and we were all being told you can't go out to pubs, you can't go out to bars, you can't go out to clubs, you can't go out to the cinema, who really believes that politicians and elite types in this land were not going out to private members clubs, which would have still been open? Do we really believe that Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock and all these other politicians that are telling us we can't go out are not still going out and enjoying themselves in their own way, in their own private, limited circles? I think they most probably were.
Yeah, they're probably enjoying it even more now, right? Because they have a really, really exclusive relationship with that activity. Yeah, so that's an interesting concept you bring up about assets in sort of the dance scene and the music business. Paul Oakenfold does strike me as somebody like that. I think he did the soundtrack for the movie Swordfish, if I'm not mistaken. Have you seen that movie by any chance, Swordfish with John Travolta?
No, I've not seen that. I know Oakenfold has done a whole load of film scores. He really made a name for himself in America in the 90s when he got involved with film scores. He's done several, but I've not seen Swordfish, no.
It's worth seeing because there's a lot of hidden in plain sight show and tell stuff in Swordfish. And that this just happens to be a film that he scored. But when you look back at sort of the genesis of the rave scene, let's just say like maybe 88, 89, 90, right around there in the UK, and you had the big festivals that would just shoot up like a mushroom off one of the M's. Did you ever have a sense that Tavistock had its fingers in any of that stuff?
Well, back then, absolutely not. I was a part of that scene. I wasn't active as a DJ in that whole scene, but I did go out as a raver. When I became popular as a DJ and successful as a DJ, I was actually playing black music like R&B, hip hop, reggae, ragga, dancehall, that sort of stuff. So I never really played the rave and dance music stuff, but I was a fan. I used to go to clubs and I kept a very close eye on the scene. But back when it was happening, I had no insight at all into the idea that there might be more to it. Really, I only started researching this stuff in 2010. So I'm 10 years deep. And when I first realized that the world is nothing like we thought it was, and it's actually run by very different people and very different networks to those that we're told about, I immediately wanted to understand how that affected the corporate music industry, and specifically dance music, electronic music, and urban music, because those have been my special areas of interest. So I threw myself into that type of research, and I was especially interested in that early UK rave, acid house dance music scene, because I saw a lot of evidence that whole movement, in fact, was a reboot for a new generation of what was done in the 1960s with the counterculture hippie scene of those times. And I could see that whereas in the late 60s, you had these new types of music, psychedelic rock music and folk rock and country rock, and they were very unlike anything that had gone previously. You had huge doses of LSD and mescaline and all kinds of other entheogens and hallucinogenics all over the scene, but mainly LSD. And there's so much documentation now to show that stuff was put into the scene. It was put into these hippie communes and these gatherings and these festivals at the hands of the CIA. That seems to be the source of most of it. And then you had the kind of spiritual aspect. The age of Aquarius was being pushed, and Eastern mysticism, and all these kind of occult, esoteric ideas. So then when you apply that to what was going on in the UK from 1987-88 onwards, you had a new type of music that was very unlike anything that had gone before. And this was the emergence of electronic dance music, acid house in its earliest form. Instead of LSD everywhere, you had ecstasy, or E as it was known, MDMA as it's known these days. And much of this seemed to be coming out of government sources. The intelligence community seemed to be putting out a lot of E into the market. There was an unending supply of the stuff virtually overnight that came into all these big festivals and gatherings and raves. And then you had all the symbolism and all the occult aspects of these early raves. If you look at any of the flyers that advertised these events, a lot of them were pushing the same sort of spiritual metaphysical ideas as you had back in the 1960s, which is why I say it was a reboot of that whole thing for a new generation on the opposite side of the Atlantic. And I think the social engineers had studied what was achieved by that 60s counterculture scene and decided it was time to apply this in the UK as a big social experiment to see what would happen if you got large numbers of young people together in one place and you hit them with all these different influences, all these different assaults on their senses and their consciousness all at once. And I'm pretty sure that's what happened there. So there have been very few other researchers that have drawn parallels between that 60s scene and the 80s acid house scene. And to me, it's a real elephant in the room. It seems very, very obvious now, with the benefit of hindsight and with the ability to do the research, that there was an agenda at play there. This scene did not evolve organically. It was made to occur by those whose full-time jobs it is to create scenes and movements and trends like this. And just looking at a couple of the key players that were very instrumental in getting that acid house scene off the ground. One of them was the aforementioned Paul Oakenfold. So we've got this fable, this myth of these 4 London DJs who apparently went out to Ibiza in August of 1987 to celebrate Paul Oakenfold's birthday. So it was Oakenfold, it was Danny Rampling, Nicky Holloway, and Johnny Walker. You hear very little of Johnny Walker these days. It's not the guy that was on Radio 1. It's a different DJ. He seems to have faded away from the scene. Nicky Holloway went through a phase as a club promoter. He became an alcoholic, had some real problems with that and had to take some time away from the scene. But Danny Rampling and Paul Oakenfold have been consistently popular and consistently successful. And I did try to look into some of their backgrounds. All that I could really find about Oakenfold was, apart from the fact that he trained to be a chef, and then seemed to throw all that away and became a DJ, and a very successful one, was that part of his time working as a chef was at the Royal Army and Navy Club in the UK. So that's a bit of a red flag for me, with all the research that I've done into the vast number of musicians and people connected to the music industry who have family connections going into the military or aspects of military intelligence or aspects of government departments, the establishment. And then with Danny Rampling, the interesting thing is that he himself posted a picture on his Twitter a few years ago of him in full army regalia when he was evidently an army cadet. And he posted a caption saying he was very proud to have served with the group that he did. So you got this guy who was evidently in the army. Then he emerges as this very prominent and successful DJ. And along with Oakenfold, pretty much shapes and molds the very early genesis of the British acid house scene. And there's some tenuous links going back into, military connections there, which I find very interesting.
That is interesting. It always seems to kind of link back to the military in a lot of these movements, whether it's Laurel Canyon or other aspects of the 60s and probably even for this kind of rave explosion that happens 88, 89, 90. The other thing that sort of struck me, it was in Simon Reynolds' book Generation Ecstasy, which is a pretty good book if you guys want to kind of wrap your heads around kind of that period of time. That the promoters of a lot of these events seem to have like descended from elite families. Like these were not sort of just your, guy hustling off the street. These were very well connected, very well funded promoters, very sharp, understood cell phones, understood the beeper culture, the whole 9 yards. So even at the promotional aspect, there seemed to be kind of an elite reach into this event or into this kind of phenomenon.
That's right. You had a promoter of early British raves like Sunrise and some of these other really successful ones by the name of Tony Colston Hayter. And he came from, a very upper class, well-to-do family. I think he was a stockbroker by trade, but he got involved in the rave promotions game and evidently earned an absolute fortune out of it. He was done on criminal charges many years ago for some kind of fraud or embezzlement, which tells you a lot. So you had him as a very prominent figure in those early raves. And then when you look at one of the early British super clubs, which came off the back of the rave and festival scene. So once the acid house thing had kind of fizzled out in its first format, you then had the emergence of these huge super clubs, which by the mid-90s had become an absolute ritual for young people all over the UK to go out and party at one of these places like Cream and Gatecrasher and all these other names. But one of the early clubs was the Ministry of Sound in London, which launched in September 1991. It was very much modelled on the Paradise Garage in New York. There was a guy called Justin Berkman, who was the main DJ at Ministry, who had been very much influenced by Larry Levan and all his experiences at the Paradise Garage. And he wanted to recreate that whole vibe in London. But the financial backer and the main guy behind the Ministry of Sound enterprise was a dude by the name of James Palumbo. And he comes from an aristocratic family. And I think his official title now is a Baron of Southwark in London. He's actually known to be a baron, so he's very much from that elite class of society. And he was a very unlikely candidate to be behind this gritty, raw kind of nightclub in South London, which was known for a lot of violent behavior, and there were drive-by shootings and all kinds of drama jumping off down there. You wouldn't necessarily expect someone with his sort of background to be involved in something like that unless there was an aspect of social engineering and an aspect of wanting to change culture and change public mindsets and just change the whole way that young people went about their leisure time, living their lives.
Right. Absolutely. So we can see this very interesting reach from the military. It's not the same players. Maybe it is sometimes, but certainly is sort of the same, algebraic formula in some ways. And if you understand that, you can see the patterns, and the patterns emerge. Go, oh yeah, here we go.
You see so many examples of it. I mean, one that I've just found out about recently is there's a British government minister by the name of Grant Shapps. And just a few days ago, he was on TV telling everyone that they should carry a mask with them when they leave home. If you have a mask with you, you'll always be prepared for when you go into a shop or a supermarket or one of these confined spaces where you're required to wear a mask. So he's pushing the official government rhetoric that we've got to wear masks now, and he's towing the official line. Well, the interesting thing about Grant Shapps is he just happens to be a cousin of Mick Jones, one of the founding members of The Clash, that new wave group out of England. And he's got a cousin, I think it's a brother, who was in the group Big Audio Dynamite. And this was a group that emerged in the 1980s off the back of The Clash. Mick Jones was the frontman of that group as well. And then when you delve further into The Clash, you find out that Joe Strummer, whose real name was John Graham Mellor, his father was a British diplomat working, in government departments. So everyone thinks of The Clash as this anti-establishment, rebellious new wave group that's all about rebellion and breaking free of the system and all this in terms of the messages they put out. But you've got a couple of of the key members that have direct connections into the government and right into British establishment. And you find it with so many other groups in so many other genres. The Specials, the two-tone group that came out of Coventry, part of that whole two-tone scene of the late 1970s that went in tandem with the punk and new wave scene. You got Jerry Dammers there, who was like the leading force behind the Specials, and it turns out that his father was an Anglican bishop. He was some kind of religious figure. And it's a similar story with Tim Westwood, who is the most prominent and influential hip-hop and rap DJ in the UK, has been for many years. He went to a public school in Norwich, very elite, very expensive public school. And it turns out that his dad was also an Anglican bishop. He was the Bishop of Peterborough, among many other positions that he held. So how likely is it that somebody coming from that kind of family background would really find themselves in the rap and hip hop scene of London in the early 80s, hanging out in all these, dodgy, dangerous clubs and shaping and molding a career for themselves as a DJ? And how likely is it that you'd find members of these other families becoming punk and new wave musicians? In Musical Truth Volume 2, I detailed a whole load of examples of punk and new wave musicians out of New York who have family backgrounds connected to the US establishment in some way. It's aristocratic families, it's aspects of the Pentagon, the Defense Department, the CIA, the FBI, it's aspects of Congress. You have direct family links into all these institutions. You can only write one or two of these off as just one of those things, a coincidence, or the kids rebelling against their parents and the values that they stood for by going off down a different route. When you see it happening time and time and time again across multiple genres, if you're really going to be honest with yourself, and if you're going to apply critical thought to the situation, you have to conclude that these people that crop up in all these prominent groups, in these very influential positions, have been placed there by virtue of the families that they came out of and the connections and affiliations that they have. So the leaders of any of these scenes are chosen. It's not left to random chance who's going to rise to those kind of positions. I mean, another example would be Lady Gaga. Like I say, this crosses different musical boundaries. Lady Gaga has been an incredibly influential and successful pop star for the past several years. And it turns out that her mother, Cynthia Germanotta, was recently named as the mental health ambassador to the United Nations. You couldn't make this stuff up. You got Lady Gaga curating this One World at Home concert back in April, where you got all these musicians in their front rooms around the world, supposedly performing for everyone else via a live stream because they can't go out and do gigs because it's too dangerous. The virus is everywhere. Right. How many people have had their mental health directly impacted by the restrictions of lockdown? Through not being able to have social interactions and contact with others, through not being able to see family members. I mean, first of all, how many suicides have happened as a result of the...
Oh, yeah, the suicide numbers are up. They're totally up.
The absolute desolation and misery and psychological torture of being told you've got to stay in your home and you can no longer go out and do the things you used to like doing, and you can't see the people you used to like seeing. And if you're someone with mental health issues who was maybe getting counseling sessions one-on-one, face-to-face, now you're told you've got to do that via a Zoom call on your goddamn computer screen, it's hardly the same. So people are suffering from all these mental health issues. Lady Gaga's curating this concert talking about this is the new normal now, and isn't it great that you can see Mick Jagger and Elton John in their front rooms playing for you through your phone screen. And her mother is the ambassador for mental health to the United Nations, claiming to care about the mental health of the people out there. You really couldn't make it up, and you don't have to.
Yeah. We did a show. I did a show on the Clash, probably about 8 or 9 months ago, and it got pulled from YouTube because I was using some footage from, I think it was from Julian Temple's movie or something like that, and definitely got into sort of the deep dive around Strummer and his father being this, quote unquote, diplomat, and diplomats are really just spies and ties is really what they are. And then the whole relationship, the very weird relationship with his brother, who after they graduate from school winds up dead on this little, tiny island, I think, in the River Thames or something, like little, he's out rowing, right? He's out rowing and he's dressed in full Nazi regalia, and he's dead. He kills himself, and he became this full-on full-blown kind of Nazi, very quiet guy, and very kind of dark part of Joe Strummer's past. And then you have a band like the Police with Stuart Copeland, whose father was the head of the CIA, basically, in Beirut, and rubbed shoulders with Kim Philby and all these other people, right? Miles Copeland. I mean, this stuff goes really, really deep. And the one that I just uncovered lately, which I think you might find of interest because of your background, and especially playing music that's R&B, soul, and funk, has to do with the mayor of Atlanta, her name is Keisha Bottoms, Lance Keisha Bottoms, right? Keisha Lance Bottoms. That's her name, Keisha Lance Bottoms. And her father was a guy by the name of Major Lance. And Major Lance had 2 hits that were part of the Northern Soul scene. And he actually toured England with Elton John as a member of his touring band when Elton John was known as Reggie. Okay, so this is a very interesting connection. Now, everybody, well, we think most everybody in Major Lance's line comes from Major Lance and theoretically, the mother of his kids, except for Keisha Lance Bottoms. Keisha Lance Bottoms is the daughter of Major Lance and Sylvia Robinson, who basically started the whole hip hop scene, right?
Records.
Yeah, right, with Sugar Hill. So that's her mother. Okay, so this is the mother of the mayor of Atlanta, and if you go back into her background, she has Dutch heritage, and it kicks her right out to the Dutch Antilles and the whole other kind of relationship with culture, and again, a lot of those families were slave owners, like specifically Kamala Harris. So this is one of these things that if you dig deep enough, you'll find that there's these really bizarre connections that connect these people that wind up making very influential decisions on our lives, either via music or, in this case, politics, and with Lady Gaga's mother, policy.
When you go into the ancestry of many of these celebrities, many of these music stars as well, you realize that for generations, their family has been in influential positions. 2 or 3 generations ago, they might have been the mayor of a particular town, or they might have been a priest in a particular religious institution or something like that. And people have often said that with elite families, they want to make sure they've got all bases covered in terms of having an influence on them. So they might put one of their children into law, they might put one of them into politics, they might put one into medicine, but they will always reserve a role in entertainment for one of their key offspring as well, whether it's as an actor or maybe a television presenter or particularly a musician. They would want someone from that family to have some kind of influential position in the music industry. And we find so many examples of this. I've uncovered so many myself. As you said there, it's so incestuous. You see all these different links between these different families and these different key players. It crosses genres. You find these kind of nefarious links in rap music. You find it in grunge. You find it in heavy rock. It's absolutely everywhere. So I'm currently researching the next book, which is going to be Musical Truth Volume 3. And there's going to be another chapter in there on lifetime actors. So in Volume 2, I did a big chapter walking readers through the concept of a lifetime actor. Somebody that you think of by way of the public role that they have, whether it's as a musician or an actor or whatever it is. But when you delve into their background and their links and affiliations, you realize that it's not by accident that they're in that position. So the new book is going to have a whole new chapter of things that I've uncovered, some of these more links. And people might say, well, this story has been told. We now understand that all these key influential people come from these different, these selected backgrounds. Why do we need to hear more of it? Well, I just want it to be documented how many examples there are of this. And I want my books to be a kind of one-stop shop to really make the point beyond all doubt, beyond all reasonable claims to the contrary, that anyone in any kind of influential position who's got a household name of celebrity status that everyone's heard of has been placed there. You do not get to climb that ladder to those heights on your own back, on your own terms. It's always on the industry's terms. And there are so many more examples that we can cite of that that I've uncovered. So that will be coming up in Musical Truth Volume 3.
That's great. That's awesome. I wanted to ask you about the folk scene, because I think the folk scene is one of these very, I wouldn't say it's underrated, but I don't think a lot of people have paid a lot of attention to the emergence of the folk scene in the early 60s, and how that in and of itself was a very astroturf scene to coincide with, the civil rights movement, the protest movement, and that all kind of emerging out of this, this other kind of space called the coffee house, right? And how people could get together and drink coffee and get all wired up, and and it was really sort of an incubator for a certain type of social movement. Have you looked into the folk scene very much, and sort of the tentacles that reach out from that genre?
Not in a huge way, no. I know the 60s folk scene was heavily influenced by the beat poets, the beat generation of the sort of late 50s going into the 60s, the likes of Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac and William Burroughs. And these people heavily influenced the counterculture of the later 1960s as well. Right. The musicians there, the creative types, were very much drawing on what the beat poets had done before in terms of their work. And I think the folk scene was kind of carrying that forward. There are elements of social engineering going on there. The 1960s was a very volatile time in terms of changing culture and changing societal attitudes, particularly the latter half of the 60s. So it's inconceivable to me that the folk scene would have been allowed to continue organically and without influence and dabbling in the same way that the counterculture scene was.
Well, every movement needs a soundtrack, and most movements are generally astroturf. They're generated to grab people and take them along on a particular wave. And I think that the folk scene was that soundtrack for that whole kind of civil rights era, that whole, that, and it is a movement. And in a lot of ways, a lot of that was astroturf, and a lot of people don't like to hear that. And there's validity in, people living together and having equality. Don't get me wrong. Right. But, Rosa Parks did not just decide to sit on a bus one day and protest the fact that she wasn't going to be in the back. Rosa Parks was essentially a trained socialist, and she went to the Highlander School in Tennessee, which is also where Martin Luther King went. So there was a lot of hands-on training that was going on during that time. And a lot of people don't understand that. So you have to have a soundtrack that goes along with the movement. And I think that's part and parcel with what we've seen. One of the things I also wanted to ask you about, let's just move this thing forward. I wanted to see if you had any insight on the folk scene. What about Creation Records and that whole vibe? Because I saw this documentary on Creation Records, and there was this whole kind of very occult, magical, dark magical undercurrent with Creation Records, and a very, very popular and very influential record label in the late 80s and early 90s. So what's your take on Creation Records, and what kind of background info do you have on those guys?
Well, I did put a section in Musical Truth Volume 2 about Creation Records. At the helm of it was its creator, Alan McGee. And he has stated on many occasions in interviews that he is a follower of the work of Aleister Crowley, the dark occultism that he practiced. He's into Thelema, and he's into chaos magic. So he's a very adept occultist by all accounts. And this appears to have had some play out in the formation of Creation and in the selection of the bands that came to be featured on that label, the most famous of which would be Oasis, of course. And there's lots to know about Oasis when you delve into the Gallagher brothers and what they're all about.
Well, let's go there for a second. Stop right there. I want to know more about the Gallagher brothers. We'll break that.
Well, there is a photograph of Liam hanging out with Jimmy Savile, which is on the internet, and he's flashing up with the so-called devil horns like this,
right? Yeah,
and sitting next to Jimmy Savile, and that requires a bit of explaining, as far as I'm concerned, when we consider the revelations about Jimmy Savile that later came out. And I just feel that Oasis were an entirely contrived and created band. And a lot of people are going to be, furiously angry at me for making that suggestion. But again, it just comes down to do you get to be that successful as Oasis were if you're not playing the game, if you're not an asset of the system, if you're not towing certain lines? And Oasis came out around about the same time as Blur, and they were pitched against them as rivals in what was known as the Britpop scene of the mid-90s. And it was another dialectic. We get these playing out pretty much every generation. In the 1960s, young people were given the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Yeah. And they were kind of coerced into picking a side. Which one do you like? Do you prefer the Beatles or the Stones? And the Beatles appealed to certain people, certain demographics, and those that rejected the Beatles because they were too soft or whatever preferred the Rolling Stones. But the truth of the matter is that both groups were being controlled by the same forces. Ultimately, there's evidence to suggest that both of them were creations of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, right. And it was all about the social engineering that was going on in the 1960s in tandem with what was happening over there in the States. Then you've had different playouts of this. In the 80s, I remember that Duran Duran in the New Romantic era were pitched against Spandau Ballet. And all the girls that were into these groups picked a side. You were either a Durrani or you were into Spandau, you know. So Blur versus Oasis, to me, was just the latest play out of this dialectic where both sides are controlled by the same forces, and it doesn't really matter which group somebody likes because they're being played either way because these groups are assets of the system and they're, pushing agendas. So that's how I feel about those groups.
Right. I heard that Damon Albarn's a Mason. Is that right? Is he a Freemason? That's what I've heard.
Well, I've never heard that, but it wouldn't surprise me if he is. He's certainly an MBE. He's been knighted by the Queen. And his other group was the Gorillas, which was post-Blur. And they're a kind of virtual group that appears in cartoon form. And they first appeared many years ago. And for me, it was preparing people for the kind of transhumanist artificial intelligence reality that was going to be rolled out in the years to come. Everything's virtual. Everything's done by AI. And it was kind of a slow drip subliminal preparation for the type of situation we've got now. It was just interesting hearing you talk there about how the folk scene back in the 60s went in tandem with all the civil rights stuff and all the social movements of the time, and you can apply that to pretty much every decade since. There's been a musical format or a musical genre that ties into the social conditions of the time. In the 1970s, you had the emergence of punk with the Sex Pistols at the hands of Malcolm McLaren, right at the time that you had all these trade union disputes and problems with the government of the time. And then Margaret Thatcher came in with the Conservative Party in 1979 at the time that you had New Wave. And then after that, the two-tone scene and the New Romantics came in. And there always seems to be a music form or a music scene that ties in with the social conditions of the time. Right. But again, going back to what we were talking about earlier in the show, what do we have now by way of any kind of music scene that ties into these times? I can't think of anything. So could it really be that that's a done deal now, and that the social engineering that's been achieved through the music industry, through these multiple generations and these multiple genres, is pretty much finished? They really are moving on to different ways of doing things. Maybe they think they've got the public mindset right where they want it. Maybe artificial intelligence just around the corner is the next way that people are going to be controlled and manipulated, and there's no longer a need for music scenes and prominent musicians coming off the back of it in the way that they have been in previous generations. That's quite an alarming thought, isn't it?
Well, it is an alarming thought, and one that I don't think would be too far out of place in terms of the discussion. I'm an astrologer, and so I work with astrology. And last week, I think it was last week or week before, I looked at the Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder fight, and I looked at it from an astrological perspective. Also, there's some very interesting connections there with the sort of the precursor of Corona, because you see Tyson Fury basically coming into Las Vegas with a crown on his head, right? He's the Gypsy King. And then you have Deontay Wilder coming into the ring with a mask on his face. So it's a very interesting kind of like precursor and synthesis to basically where we're headed. And then at the end of the fight, Tyson Fury, who I think is a very interesting character, sings "Bye Bye American Pie." Right? He sings that in the ring, and it's about the day the music died. And it feels like really appropriate on so many levels, because it was 11 days after that when the NBA said, okay, we're not going to have our season anymore. And it was sort of like this crown in a lot of ways, like this kind of crowning moment. Las Vegas, boxing, history. And there was even a very interesting relationship with Wilder and Fury in that they got along. And Tyson Fury congratulated Deontay Wilder as being a great warrior and he'd be a great champ again one of these days. And then everything just goes into this deep inversion about 11 days later. And it just, some of these things just blow my mind when they happen. But I don't think somebody got into Tyson Fury's ear and said, hey, look, you're going to sing American Pie, Bye-Bye American Pie, after you win this fight. So sometimes I think there are archetypal kinds of moments. And I think those are very resonant. And I think there are these moments where they are created and conspired and astroturfed. And I think there are a lot more of the latter versus the former. But when the former happened, they're very profound and they resonate. And when I watched the end of that fight, it was like, wow, this is the end of something. And I don't think Tyson Fury knew that. And I don't think somebody from MI6 got in his ear and said, look, you're going to sing this song at the end.
So you think that's a play out of synchromysticism, as it's referred to?
I do believe that was a synchromystic moment. Absolutely. Now, Deontay Wilder has a history of wearing masks. See, that's the one thing about Wilder. And some of his masks are very much like, a mask that Bane would, wore in Batman, or a mask that in an extreme way we would look at as kind of a corona blocker or whatever. So what he was wearing was a full helmet mask, but it was a mask nonetheless. So it wasn't like all of a sudden, he's going to be putting on a mask. That was his calling card. And when Tyson Fury came into the ring, he was wearing a crown because he was the Gypsy King. So we had this collision. I think it was a synchronistic collision in that moment. And then there's, again, it just drops off like the Marianas Trench, because after that, everything absolutely changes. And I thought it was fascinating. And it does feel like, we're in a very new sort of skitter box of programming, and music is not part of the soundtrack at all, unless you listen to Tech 69, which I refuse to do.
Yeah, wise choice.
Yeah.
I mean, really, when you think about it, there haven't been any scenes or genres for many, many years. I mean, I'm thinking back to the 90s. In the 90s, you had the emergence of grunge, you had drum and bass, you had techno and hard house and these different forms of dance music. Then you could take that into the early 2000s. There were a few spin-offs of hip-hop and reggae dancehall and Afro beats and reggaeton and stuff like that. But I'm hard-pressed to think of any specific genre that's emerged since, let's say, 2005. I mean, you've had the prominent artists of the past several years have been the likes of Beyonce, Rihanna, Lady Gaga, Katy Perry, Taylor Swift, Miley Cyrus, people like this. How do you even define their music beyond, I mean, you could call it garbage, but I suppose collectively it's known as pop music. But right. there's no label you can put on it. There are very few bands that have forged a scene, a movement, a sound like grunge or like two-tone or anything like that. So we've been without any kind of discernible identity to popular music for many years already. But, there was a lot of predictive programming type symbolism pertaining to the coronavirus, which occurred in the years leading up to 2020. I've been researching this. A big chapter in my upcoming book is going to be all about this. I'm doing a live presentation about it in a couple of weeks as well. There was foreknowledge of this whole COVID-19 scamdemic years and years ago, and it appears in the form of documentation, actually, coming out of so-called elite circles. So you've got this document that emerged just recently, which originated in 2010. It's been doing the rounds online. A lot of people have been sharing it. It's from the Rockefeller Foundation, and it's this lockstep document. It's very detailed, and it's talking about preparedness for the type of worldwide pandemic which we're now told we have. And it's the Rockefeller Foundation think tank addressing what would need to be done in this kind of instance. And then, of course, more recently to these times, you had the Event 201 exercise, which took place in New York in October of last year, just 2 months before we're told COVID-19 originated out of Wuhan, China. And this was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. What a bloody surprise. In conjunction with Johns Hopkins University and the World Economic Forum. And they're all at this conference. They've got all these so-called experts working out what we would do if there were this deadly virus which were to appear out of nowhere, how it would affect society, what measures would need to be put into place. And then when you get into works of popular culture, you realize that there are foreshadowings of the coronavirus going back many, many years there as well. There is this Dean Koontz novel called Edge of Darkness, which was published in 1981. Again, this has been doing the rounds greatly on the internet in recent times, because in this story, he tells of a deadly virus which originates out of China, and it decimates the world in 2020. And this was written right back in 1981, nearly 40 years ago. Then there was this psychic author, or, she claims to be a psychic, called Sylvia Brown, who put out a book in 2008, Future Prophecies and Predictions. And she spoke of this deadly virus, which comes out of nowhere in the year 2020. It decimates the world, and then it very quickly goes away again, almost as quickly as it came. And she says 10 years later, it reemerges. Then it goes away again, and it's never heard of from that point on. So it really makes you wonder. There's a music video from a hip-hop act known as Dr. Creep, and it's called Pandemic, and it came out, I think it was 2017. And in the lyrics, he talks of the 2020 coronavirus, like 3 years before it came along. So was that just a lucky guess, or did the forces behind that group and that record have some kind of inside knowledge? Dr. Anthony Fauci stood up there in 2017 at a conference and said this administration, meaning the first term of Trump's administration, is going to have to deal with a major pandemic. That was 2017. That was a lucky guess, wasn't it? How was he in such a position to know that this was coming? There are so many other examples. Madonna at the 2019 Eurovision Song Contest put on a performance which certainly seemed to strongly hint at this coming pandemic, or at least the narrative of it. So she's doing this song with a so-called reggae artist called Quavo, and she's flanked by dancers that are wearing gas masks. And at one point, she kind of breathes on them, and you get the sound of like a gust of wind, a gale force, and all these dancers in the gas masks fall down as if they're dead. And then she does this quirky song, which contains lyrics like, not everybody here is going to make it, not everyone is coming to the future. And on the back cover of the album from which that song was taken, released around about the time of this Eurovision performance in spring of 2019, you've got Madonna's gloved hands typing away on a typewriter. And guess what the brand of typewriter just happens to be? It's Corona. The same one that Tom Hanks is evidently very fond of collecting, a Corona typewriter. So all these things hint at knowledge that this event was coming many, many months or years before it actually did. And we find this with every major world event. I've detailed in my books all the predictive programming pertaining to 9/11, to 7/7, and to every other terror false flag event that we've had. There's always an element of it that appears in music videos or movies or TV shows running up to it. I mean, South Park, The Simpsons have previous on this. There are elements of the coronavirus situation in both of those shows as well. So we're always being forewarned of it, but the trouble is it's always being done in coded, cryptic, symbolic form. And who reasonably can be expected to decode what's being communicated here in any meaningful way?
Yeah. Well, that reminds me of that record by The Coup, Party Music, where they had the Twin Towers behind them and exploding. Right.
He's got a detonator in his hand.
He's got a detonator in his hand. Yeah. Boots. They're from
Boots
Oakland.
Riley, I think. Yeah.
Boots Riley. Yeah. And Pam the Funktress, who was part of I actually saw The Coup live one time. They were quite good. And Pam the Funktress, I think, passed away. So now
really?
it's just now it's just boots.
Oh,
But
wow.
there were a number of those kinds of tells, right? Like the Lone Gunman, the spinoff from the X-Files. They have that one episode that's just all about 9/11. It's basically they're laying it all out. There's planes headed towards the Twin Towers, and it was one of those episodes that was kind of buried. There's even the band James has that song "Born of Frustration," and there's a scene at the end of that video where there is a bird flying into like a tower, and it's not quite the same. But I've watched that video at least 100 times just to get to that one scene. And I'm like, well, where's that coming from? That's a band I like, by the way. I thought Tim Booth was a pretty talented guy. Yeah.
Well, there's another element of coronavirus predictive programming, which I forgot, which is a very powerful one. There was a TV adaptation of Stephen King's Dead Zone stories.
Oh, right. With
between 2003 and 2007, I think. Yeah. And there's this one particular episode as part of that series, came out in 2005, where the characters in the story are talking about this deadly virus, which has come out of nowhere and is said to have originated in China. Go figure. And they're talking about all the measures and all the things they've got to implement to stop the spread of it. They're saying we've got to shut down the schools. We've got to make everyone stay indoors. People can't go to public places. They've got to limit the spread of this thing. We've got to go into lockdown, And as the story progresses, they're talking about finding a cure for this deadly disease. And they name the cure that is to be administered as chloroquine, which is only one step away from hydroxychloroquine, which Donald Trump has been talking about as a very effective remedy for the so-called coronavirus. It's an anti-malarial drug. So there are so many elements of what we're being told now that were right there on public display as long ago as 2005. And this always happens.
Yep.
And a lot of the time they find very obscure vehicles to put it out through as well. It's not always the most...
They make you work for it.
Yeah,
it's not always
the most prominent movies. It's not always the most prominent music artists whose videos they put this into. I mean, who had heard of the coup prior to this 9/11 business? I certainly hadn't. The only way I know who they are is through having researched the bloody symbolism, this whole thing. So they sometimes pick very obscure outlets. And as far as they see it, they've given you an opportunity to know what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
If you choose not to look at it, or if you've never heard of this group, or if you've never heard of this movie or TV show, as far as they're concerned, that's your lookout, because you were given the opportunity to know what they were doing. And they feel this absolves them of any kind of karmic responsibility for the harm that is caused by the event that they go ahead and do, because they take our not saying no as being good as us saying yes, our tacit approval to the situation.
That's right.
Very complicated metaphysical concept, but it's one that they adhere to each and every time, nevertheless.
Right. Yeah. The old hidden in plain sight predictive programming.
Revelation of the method.
Revelation of the method. Absolutely. And there's so many examples of that stuff out there too. If recently there was that very obscure short-lived animated series. I think it might have been on Adult Swim or Cartoon Network, where Kobe Bryant crashes in a helicopter, right? And a very poorly drawn cartoon. It was almost like they did the cartoon just so they could have the scene in some ways. But that's to your point. It was just incredibly obscure. So what can we look forward to? What sources should we be mining now so that we can see into the future and begin to understand what's coming in our direction? Personally, I think it's aliens. I think the alien thing is going to start to come front and center. They keep talking about it on Tucker Carlson. They keep saying that they've got, more and more information. They've got more and more footage. So what sort of old alien movies should we be looking at to begin to predict what's going to happen next? Because I think that's where this is going.
Well, I hadn't really given much thought to the alien agenda. I'm familiar with Project Bluebeam, which is this technology they have where they can evidently project an image of a UFO into the skies, which looks very realistic and which would fool many people into thinking that we're under attack from aliens. I don't really go into that whole subject area myself. I don't place a lot of stock in it. But I realized that it would be a very powerful one to use for mind control. There is a scene actually in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, a very prominent E.T. movie from Steven Spielberg, where there's a meeting that's due to take place between humans and these extraterrestrials that have been coming to Earth at a place called Devil's Mountain. And there's this small group of people that have felt instinctively compelled to go there. They've been drawn there kind of intuitively. And the army has sealed off the whole area around Devil's Mountain. They don't want these people to come there because they know that there's going to be this encounter with aliens, and they don't want the public getting involved. So what do? They create the narrative of this disease, this pandemic that's in the area. They say that there's this deadly contagion and nobody can be in the area. It's very harmful. And they round up a bunch of these people, including the Richard Dreyfuss character, the main figure in the film, and they put them in the back of a truck and they make them all wear gas masks because they say the air is very dangerous. And Dreyfuss is sitting there with his gas mask on and he's thinking about it, and then he takes the mask off because he's convinced it's a scam and there's nothing wrong with the air. And he breathes the clean, pure air, and he tells all the others in the back of the van, you can take your mask off, the air is just fine. They've created the virus narrative as a diversion to other stuff that's going on, i.e. the alien encounter. So I think that's quite a potent scene that tells us a lot about how if we're obsessed and fixated on one thing, we're not looking at something else that might be happening. But yeah, in response to your question about aliens and ETs, anything is possible, I guess, because I didn't see this coming. I never imagined, even in February, that we would be living our lives in this way and that the world would look the way it did, the way it does right now. They certainly pulled this one out of the bag and surprised me and seemingly most of the rest of the world. So they could do it again.
Yeah, they could, and I think they probably will. And I do think I think they're gonna play the alien card. That's my sense, because there's so much foreshadowing with this thing now, and you can kind of see beforehand where things are going. So one of the things that we looked at, while the coronavirus was going on, is what's going to happen next. And for me, when I saw the Ahmaud Arbery event, which took place in Atlanta, I'm like, okay, I know what's going to happen next. What's going to happen next is major racial strife, major racial tension. We're going to get thrust headlong into a potential race war. Well, I knew that this thing was going because they were running out of steam with the corona thing, and they needed something else very quickly to traumatize us. So Ahmaud Arbery was the second in three events. There was the Breonna Taylor event, the Ahmaud Arbery event, and then there was, of course, the George Floyd event. And you see these things seem to come in threes. And all three of those events, by the way, are very suspect for me because I've looked into them, and there are a lot of things that don't add up about each one of them. But they were cumulative, and by the time we got to George Floyd, everything had been stoked. Ahmaud Arbery had been talked about in sports shows, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and boom, there it was. And then it was like, okay, they're going to bring us back into our places. They're going to start to lock down again. Astrologically, we're going to do Mercury retrograde. We can see this coming because eventually those fires in the inner cities are going to burn. They're going to smolder, and then they're going to need the new thing, which is going to be Corona Phase 2, which is all part of a continuum as far as I'm concerned. But that Corona Phase 2 is going to come to an end, right? It's going to come to an end, and they're going to need something else. And I don't believe it's going to be a repeat of George Floyd. I don't think they could muster up that gasoline and light that match again, because in the interim between that event and now, there's been a kind of a reverse polarity around support for Black Lives Matter, because people now are kind of seeing what's happening. And after the initial shock and the first knee, it's like, whoa, wait a minute, what's really going on here? So I don't think they could hit that radicalization switch. So there's something else that's coming. And I again, I may sound like a broken record here, but I think it's the alien thing. I think we're going to have some weird, whether it's real, whether it's staged, whatever this thing is, some weird event. And I think it's going to happen in September. That's my guess. is that we're going to see something in September that's going to change something significantly. And the reason I say that is because everybody is saying that November is going to be hell. November is going to be hell. November is going to be hell. And I think it very well could be hell because of this so-called election that we're supposed to have. But I think they're going to head something off at the pass. And I don't think that November is going to manifest in a way that people are thinking about, which I've been thinking about too. I think it could be quite flammable. But I think something else is going to happen. And I think September is that month. And I do think, again, it's going to be connected to something just like what you said with coronavirus, like out of the blue. I think it's going to be this out of the blue thing. But I have a sense it's going to be the ET program. That's my feeling.
Well, then our responsibility becomes to communicate as much as we can about Project Bluebeam, that technology and what it's capable of, to as many people as possible that will listen. You know, I try and search for positives out of this whole coronavirus situation, and one of them is that a whole load of people have woken up to the fact that the world is nothing like they've spent their entire lives being entrained to think of it as. It was inevitable that would happen. That's obviously some more collateral damage that was factored into the equation. You can't pull a stunt like this without waking a whole bunch of people up. I get emails every day from people saying, this event has caused my mum or my sister or one of the guys at work to finally accept that this world is nothing like we thought it was, and we're being lied to the whole time. And it could be someone that's been on to their mum for 25 or 30 years, imploring them to wake up. And finally they have, as a result of this. So if people are going to be more open and more susceptible to ideas of what's being done to us in terms of deception and in terms of manipulation and control, then now becomes the time to talk to them about all these possibilities of what might lie around the corner, including a fake alien invasion, I guess, and any other possibility that they might try to pull out of the bag. A lot more people now are going to be far more open to that kind of discussion than was previously the case. I mean, obviously there are still the slumbering masses who are swallowing this whole thing hook, line and sinker. They're actually taking the government at their word. They're following their every instruction. They're wearing masks when they're told to. They're leaping out of the way when somebody walks along the pavement towards them because they're convinced they're going to breathe on them and they're going to die instantly. They've had the bejesus scared out of them through this propaganda, and they've bought the lie. And you can look at some of these people and you could think nothing would wake you up. You're just incapable of it in this lifetime. But many people have, many others, have finally embraced truth and freedom, and many more probably will as a result of all this stuff that's happening to us, because this year is just so plain bizarre and so strange and so unlike anything that any of us have experienced before, that it can't fail to cause large numbers of people to question what the hell is going on. And if they're prepared to accept this whole thing is a scam and has been blown out of all proportion to justify the imposition of all kinds of tyrannical measures, then they should be open to all kinds of other suggestions as well.
Yeah, totally agreed. And there is an awakening happening. I mean, that's part of the title today, the Great Awakening. And people are waking up. They're spending more time at home, cruising the internet, watching YouTube videos. And
you got the time now, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think there's a real plus side to what's happening. There's a real upside. Myself, I'm actually optimistic, because it feels like if we're going to have a chance, we have to shake this stuff out. We have to come face to face with whatever these things have been haunting us and chasing us and demonizing us and enslaving us for a very, very long period of time. So if we're going to break with the program, we got to break with the program, and we have to become very aware and familiar with it. So I'm actually optimistic, even though the town that I live in continues to be even more robotic one day after the next. I'm still encouraged by the fact that you and I are having this conversation. And not only that, but I've often felt that at times the United States and England were kind of out of sync in some ways. Like there'd be things happening culturally here that would not be happening there, and vice versa. Although there would be this interesting kind of echo effect, the Ramones would go to England, and it would be, oh, hey, punk is kind of a cool thing, right? So there'd be this kind of interesting sort of back and forth, but it would be a back and forth. It would be like a call and response. But now watching some of your videos and listening to some of the people that live in England, UK, and having a very similar kind of response or a very similar type of consciousness that I think is also very prevalent here is quite interesting. And I haven't really experienced that before between these two entities, these two countries. Have you felt into that at all? Have you given that any thought?
Yeah, I have. I've looked at the way different nations have responded to what's been done to them. That's the incredible thing about this whole narrative. You know, pretty much the whole world was put into lockdown at the same time. And that alone stands as proof positive that governments of individual countries are not making autonomous decisions on their own terms. They have higher ups in the hierarchy who are dictating policy to them. And when word comes down the line that you have to put your country into lockdown, you have to employ social distancing measures, you have to make wearing masks mandatory and all this, and all these governments jump to it in an instant, it proves that they're being given their orders from elsewhere. Who would ever believe that the whole world, all the governments of the world, would agree on the same action at the same time? We've never seen this before.
Yeah.
And this has taken people by shock. If you'd told me a couple of years ago that it would be possible to shut down all football matches in England and say you can't go to these games anymore until further notice, and there wouldn't be a revolution and a riot in the streets overnight, I wouldn't have believed you, because you know the English love their football so much that I would have always thought that if this was ever taken away from them, it would, you know, cause mayhem.
Right.
Then you have the fact that all the pubs in Ireland were closed down in St. Patrick's Day week. And if you told me a few years ago that you could ever shut down the pubs in Ireland on St. Patrick's Day and there's not a revolution in the streets overnight, I wouldn't have believed that either. But none of these things happened. The pubs were closed, the football matches were shut down, and there wasn't a riot overnight. And I think it's just because of the culture shock of the whole thing. Nobody saw this coming. It was a shock. And it all happened very quickly, certainly in the UK back in March. Like I say, week commencing 16th of March, so much happened at that time. And by that point the following week, the country was a very different place that you just wouldn't recognize. And we were all living our lives in very different ways. So it was a shock. People didn't have time to get used to the idea. And that's how it's been done so successfully. And people have responded in similar ways around the world. Most countries now have had protest events. Britain, sadly, shamefully, was very slow on the uptake. There are some protest events and some peaceful gatherings that are starting to be organized now. There's many on the way in the coming weeks. It took us long enough to get there. But I was very inspired looking at other European nations where people were defying lockdown orders. They were coming out and protesting. They weren't staying 2 meters apart. They were making it known how they felt about the whole thing. And there have been, you know, riots in Serbia just this last week, riots in Greece and various other places where people are taking it to the streets. And I know that happened in the United States in various parts early on as well. So it just shows that we are all connected. We're all part of the same human species. We all share the same kind of consciousness, and we react in similar ways to things that are done to us. And so there'll be aspects of the population that are susceptible to mind control and propaganda because they've never thought to question things at any time before in their lives. But there will also be elements of the population in every country who are prepared to stand up for their rights and freedoms and don't take kindly to any kind of imposition of them. And they're the people that will go out and demonstrate and let it be known how they feel. And we've seen this in all countries around the world. Which shows that we're all reacting to the same things being done to us in very similar ways.
Yeah. Well, you know, hats off to the Serbians, man. It was like that was really fun to watch, to see that intensity and that fervor and that dedication, that commitment.
A few Molotov cocktails there.
You know, and to come out and say, you know, we're not in favor of this, and then the people in charge actually listen and say, okay, we're gonna back off, because ultimately, I mean, that's what it takes to be able to get their attention in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So you've been putting together some mixes so that people can listen to, and are those available on your website? Some of those MP3 mixes?
Sure. I've got an ongoing music podcast series called The Sound of Freedom, which is conscious music. I've been doing this since 2013, and I'm on show 99 right now. So the next one is the big 100. And this consists of, it's mainly conscious rap and hip hop, but I have some other styles on there. I have some reggae occasionally. I have some soulful stuff. I have some dance sounds. And I go back to old records from decades past as well. There's a feature on there called The Truth Trip, where I go back to the 60s, 70s, 80s, and I find old songs where the musicians were articulating situations that we're going through right now in 2020. Mm-hmm. These songs might have been written 40 or 50 years ago, but they could have been written yesterday in terms of what they speak to. So I collate that and curate it and bring it all together in each episode. And that's available freely on Mixcloud and also on Spreaker. So if you look for DJ Mark Devlin on Mixcloud, the entire archive is there. If you go to my Spreaker, I think it's Mark-Devlin on there. You can find all those shows. And they're also available via my website, markdevlin.co.uk. And another thing that I've been doing in recent weeks is my regular FM radio show. That's called The Sound of Now. And that consists of 2 hours of soulful, uplifting house music, which I find is incredibly inspirational and powerful in these times. And I specifically select music that has a message, that has an uplifting vibe to it. And I showcase that every week as well. And I find that soulful house, a lot of which is rooted in gospel music, that's where its foundations come from, is incredibly powerful. It really speaks to the soul. It really has something to resonate with the human experience. And I'm very happy to be associated with that genre of music because, to my thinking, is pretty much the last remaining one that has not been obviously affected and infiltrated by control system agendas. Soulful house music still sounds as pure and as real to me now as it did 30 years ago when it first emerged. And I can't say that about any other form of dance music or urban music. So soulful uplifting music is great stuff that I do ally myself with. And those shows are freely available for anyone to listen to.
Awesome. Great. So there's some resources for you if you want to check in and get uplifted and putter around the house and remember the good old days. We used to stay out to 3 o'clock in the morning and not regret it, by the way. Yeah. Anything in the future for you, Mark? You have anything lined up? Any speaking tours? Anything else you got cooking?
Well, like I say, 2020 is a pretty uncertain year. Everything that I had in the diary this year has been cancelled. I should have been speaking at the Glastonbury Symposium in England this very weekend, which is a great conference, one that I always look forward to. That's been cancelled, along with everything else. I was supposed to be on tour in Australia this year. That got cancelled. I was supposed to have a big birthday party in May. That got cancelled. Family holiday got cancelled. One thing that I know is not cancelled is the gig that I've just heard about at Truth Juice in Birmingham in England. That's happening on Tuesday, the 4th of August. Anyone listening in England that can get along to Birmingham, about 8 p.m. on that Tuesday, the 4th of August, I'm going to be doing a presentation highlighting the many aspects of this coronavirus situation that have been foreshadowed in popular culture and in documents, as we got into earlier in the show. Other than that, there's nothing else in the diary because you can't really make plans this year. Nobody knows what's going to happen. And a point that I've made consistently through my weekend videos that I put out on YouTube is that this story is literally getting written day by day, week by week. And I'm not convinced that even the controllers of it know how it's going to end up. There are so many variables and we hear so many contradictions and so much flip-flopping from the politicians in terms of what they say to us. They'll tell you one thing one week and it seems to have completely changed by the following week. I know there are probably elements of psychological torture going on here, as we said earlier, where they're deliberately giving us confusing messages. So we can't make head or tail of it and we just end up in a confusing mess of cognitive dissonance. But I do think there are elements of the architects of this whole thing not really knowing themselves how it's all going to end up. And that makes it all the more important that the likes of us continue to push back against the tyranny and the imposition on our rights and freedoms in any way that we can. These events are very important where people do go out and demonstrate in their mass numbers that they do not consent. I've got my famous t-shirt on here. I do not consent and I was never asked.
There you go.
These are proving very popular at the moment. I wear these out all the time. And it's a very important message to convey to anyone that might be watching, because you can be sure, the architects, the controllers are keeping an eye on these events. They're keeping an eye on social media. They're keeping an eye on what people are saying on Facebook. They're keeping an eye on the videos that people are putting up on YouTube. And if enough people demonstrate that they know this whole thing is a lie, a monumental deception, they know that it's being used for all kinds of other ulterior motives, it might just have an effect in holding back certain aspects of the plan, which might otherwise have been imposed. But if they feel it's going to be too bloody obvious, if they now go down this route, because so many people are predicting it, so many people are warning that this could be the next thing that happens, I think there's a very real possibility that they will hold back on some of these measures and put them on the back burner for now. So that's why I say this story is getting written by the week, it's getting written by the day, and it's not just getting written by the architects of this whole thing, it's getting written by us, regular people all around the world that are kicking back against this in whatever ways we can, are communicating empowering alternative information to as many other people in whatever ways we can, and are waking up others in mass numbers as far as we can. As we spoke about earlier, that process has been taking place. It's not been taking place to the degree that it needs to, or with the numbers that it needs to, but that's not to say it can't happen if we all stay focused and stay committed and do what we know we need to do to keep pushing back against these outrageous impositions on our freedoms.
Yep. Amen to that. Support that 100%. Mark, it's been great. Thanks for being on the show today. I really appreciate your time, and I could probably spend the next 3 or 4 hours with you talking about music and untangling some of those tales and genres, but we'll have you back again sometime if you want to be a part of the show.
Thanks a lot, brother. You know what we should do when all this COVID nonsense is out of the way and we move forward to whatever the world looks like beyond it? We should probably have a conversation just about music, because we could, vibe back and forth with all that stuff, as you say.
Absolutely.
And let's stay focused on that. Let's stay committed to having that kind of conversation in a world that's very different and very much better to the one that we're all being forced to inhabit in 2020.
Amen. All right, let's give it up for Mark Devlin. Mark, you take good care. Have fun with your little ones, and stay loose, and we'll see you down the line, okay?
Thanks a lot, brother. Appreciate you getting me on. Thanks for what you do.
All right. There he is, Mark Devlin. Everybody, I'll be back on Sunday nights, Sunday Night Astro Live. Until then, use your head to discern what's real, your heart to stay open, and what's possible. markdevlin.co.uk. That's where he's at. robertphoenix.com. Chatlandia, I love you. See you on Sunday night.